Hey, special educators. Welcome to Teach, Taskbox, Inspire, the podcast dedicated to making your job as a special education teacher easier by making your instruction more fun for you and your students. Inside each episode, you'll learn how to get the most use out of your task boxes in the classroom. I'm your host, Lisa Holliday from Chalkboard Superhero, a veteran special education teacher passionate about empowering you with purposeful teaching strategies, helpful tips and tricks, and other classroom management tools that will help you thrive in your role. Let's get started with today's episode.
Welcome back to Teach, Taskbox, Inspire. I'm so glad you're here. And friends, we are so close to a huge milestone. This is episode 98, and we're just 2 weeks away from hitting episode 100. I'll be celebrating that milestone with you in a really special way. But for today, we're tackling some things that I think is one of the trickiest skills for any special educator to master: how to fade prompts without losing independence. So if you've ever felt stuck because your students rely on you too much or rely on their paraprofessionals too much, or if you've ever had that sinking feeling that you realize a child won't start a task unless you say, okay, get started, then you know exactly what I mean. Fading prompts is both an art and a science. Too much support and our students get dependent. Too little support and they flounder. We really need to try hard to find that sweet spot. So in this episode, I really want to dive into what prompt fading actually is, why it matters so much, what the common mistakes we all make are, real stories from my own classroom, and strategies you can use right away to build more independence for your students. So grab your coffee, grab your notebook, and let's get started. All right, so what's prompt fading? Let's back up and kind of really define what we're talking about. Prompt fading is the process of gradually reducing the support we give a student so they can eventually perform a skill independently. Now, prompts come in all forms: verbal, gestural, visual, model prompts, physical prompts. Sometimes we stack them together without even realizing it. So here's a real life story. I once had a student who was working on brushing his teeth. At first, I was giving a verbal prompt: pick up your toothbrush. And then I was modeling the motion, and then I was physically guiding his hand. In my mind, I was being helpful, but in reality, I was overwhelming him with too many prompts. He wasn't really learning the skill. He was waiting for me to guide him in every step. That's when it hit me. Prompts are not teaching. Prompts are scaffolds. They are temporary. And if we never plan to fade them, we're actually teaching learned helplessness. So big takeaway number one, every time you give a prompt, you need to have an exit plan for how you're going to fade it. So let's talk about why fading prompts matters. Here's the thing. Our goal in special education is always independence. Independence looks different for every student, but it always matters. If a student only writes their name when you physically guide their hand, what happens when you're not there? If a student only starts their math work when you say, okay, it's time to start, how will they ever begin all on their own? I once had a student who would sit and stare at his paper for a full 15 minutes. Believe me, I took time. But the second an adult said, go ahead, get started, or, give him a pencil, he would immediately just go at it. It wasn't that he couldn't do the work. He could. He just learned to wait for that verbal cue. And that's what happens when prompts aren't faded. So, big takeaway number two, prompts should point students toward natural cues, not adult dependency. We want them to learn to respond to the schedule, the materials, the visual supports, the environment. A lot of kids, neurotypical kids, will look around the room and know what to do. So we don't want them to pay attention to the adults and then get their cues from us. We want them to really look around. So let's talk about where this kind of goes wrong, because I think we've all made mistakes. All of these mistakes. I know that I have. Number one, over prompting. This is the classic one. We step in way too soon. A student hesitates for like a half a second and we jump in. Pick up your pencil. when maybe if we just waited, they would have picked up the pencil by themselves. I had a para who loved helping. She was so kind-hearted, but she would swoop in the second a student just looked stuck. And guess what? The student learned real quick that if they just looked confused, someone will do it for them. We need to let the kids struggle. Number 2, fading too quickly. On the flip side of this, sometimes we kind of rip off that Band-Aid a little bit too fast. We go from heavy support to zero support, and the students shut down. Imagine teaching a kid to ride a bike. You wouldn't go from holding the seat tightly to letting go on a huge hill. You'd lighten your grip gradually. And number 3, inconsistency. And this one is huge. If one adult gives a verbal prompt, another one gives a physical prompt, and another just waits too long, the student never knows what to expect. I had a student learning to wash his hands one time, and every adult in the room was prompting him differently. Once we aligned as a team, we all used the same prompts and the same fading plan, his independence skyrocketed. So the big takeaway, consistency is key. Every adult needs to be on the same page with prompt fading. All right, let's talk about what does work. Here are some strategies I've used in my classroom to make fading prompts more systematic. So number 1 is time delay. Instead of jumping in, pause. Count in your head. 1, 2, 3, before you go ahead and give that prompt. You'll be surprised how often students step up if you just give them the space to do so. Number 2, least to most prompting, which is different from most to least. So from least to most, you're going to start with the least intrusive support, like a gesture or a visual. And you're going to move up if the student truly needs more support. For example, if I want a student to pick up a block, I might first point to the block. If they don't respond, then I might add that verbal prompt in. If they still don't respond, then I model it and so on and so forth. The next one is the complete opposite, most to least prompting. So for brand new skills, sometimes you do start with more help. Hand over hand for the first few trials, then fade back to partial physical, then go to gesturing, and then nothing. This works well for safety tasks like crossing the street or cutting with scissors, stuff like that. The next one is a graduated guidance. So this one is subtle. You slowly lighten your touch, so to speak. Maybe you guide a hand fully, then you just guide them at the wrist, then you just tap them at the elbow, then you kind of hover your hand nearby without touching them. You're slowly backing away, right? The student feels less and less and less support each time, and they might not even notice that this is happening, but you're slowly letting them take the reins. The next one is visual supports. So visuals are amazing for fading. A picture schedule, a first then board, a checklist. These give the students support without you being the constant prompter. And last but not least, data sheets. This one is my favorite if you know me. Don't just track if the student got it right. Track what level of prompt that they need, because over time, you can literally see their independence growing. All right, how do we actually live this out in our classrooms, right? I'm going to give you some practical tips that you can start this week. First and foremost, train your staff. And I know people roll their eyes at this one because you know what? There's no time to do it. I get it. Everyone, paraprofessionals, therapists, volunteer people in your classroom, everyone needs to understand the prompt hierarchy. And if you are using least to most, then everyone uses least to most. Next one, set the expectation early. Make it clear that the goal is always fading. For example, if a student's learning to line up, tell your staff, we're starting with a verbal prompt, but by the end of the month, The goal is to use a visual cue only. That way, everyone's on the same page, right? Next one, celebrate the small wins. I had a student who needed physical prompts for almost everything. One day, he followed a picture schedule without any adult help for the first time. It was only for 2 activities, but we celebrated like he won the freaking Super Bowl. And it was so great. It was such a great feeling. The next one is, and this one's so hard, giving processing time. You guys, silence is golden. Sometimes just waiting 5 to 10 extra seconds gives students the chance to show what they know. Next one and last one, know your students' pace. Some kids thrive when you fade quickly. Other kids need a much slower fade. So don't be afraid to individualize your fading support throughout your entire classroom. So here's what I want you to walk away with today. Prompt fading isn't just about removing help. It's about building independence. Every time you give a prompt, ask yourself, how am I going to fade this? Because the goal isn't for students to need us forever, especially if you're at the high school level. They're going to be out in the real world real quick, and they're not going to have an adult all of the time. So we need to do as little as possible for them. And what I tell my paraprofessionals is I am working them out of a job. I do not want to need these paraprofessionals all of the time. So I am always talking about this in my classroom. So we've talked about what prompt fading is, why it matters, the mistakes to avoid, strategies to use, and real-life tips you can try tomorrow. So my challenge for you this week is to pick one student and look at the prompts you're already using. Where can you step back just a little bit and let independence shine through? All right, next week in episode 99, we're going to shift gears and talking about building paraprofessional confidence from day one. Because let's be honest, if your staff doesn't understand prompt fading, it's not going to stick. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Teach, Taskbox, Inspire. I hope you've gained some tips and motivation to fuel your week ahead. If you're ready to explore more strategies for empowering your students as independent learners, be sure to dive into my free training at chalkboardsuperhero.com/training. And don't keep all this knowledge to yourself. Share this episode with your special education teacher friends who could use some motivation and inspiration. One more thing before you go. If you're finding this podcast helpful and want to show support, head to Apple Podcasts and leave your rating and review. Until next time, keep teaching, taskboxing, and inspiring.